Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner.
If you like the show, please rate and review it on the platforms wherever you listen to podcasts, particularly on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find us and grow the show. And of course, you can learn more about Flute New Music Consortium at flutenewmusicconsortium.com.
A powerfully virtuosic and multifaceted clarinetist, Chris Grymes playing is eloquent, animated, and free of any interpretive self-indulgence, according to the Strad. Chris is a musician with a stunningly broad portfolio, a tenured professor, a principal orchestral clarinetist, a concerto soloist, a chamber musician, commissioning collaborative artist, and now the founder of his own indie classical label, OpenG Records. At OpenG, Chris oversees and curates a collective of musicians, composers, and recording engineers dedicated to the old-school craft of creating and performing serious classical music. The OpenG artist roster produces recordings, live performances, newly commissioned works, podcast interviews, and essays about music, art, life, and much more. Chris is also a presenting partner at National Sawdust, New York City's newest classical music hall, which allows Chris to curate and produce concerts featuring both established performers and composers, as well as emerging artists. Chris grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He now lives in New York City with his wife, Rachel, and his sons, Saul and Lenny. Chris prefers his bourbon single barrel, his Radiohead Loud, and his basketball Hoosier Red. Chris, I've seen aspects of what you've been up to these past couple of decades, and, I'm always impressed by what you come up with for yourself. So I'm really excited to catch up with you a little bit today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. I'm really complimented that you asked me to be here, and I'm really happy to talk about myself for a while. It's a narcissist dream, really.
There's always that awkward moment in the podcast room before we start hitting the record button, and our listeners aren't going to get to hear it, but I've been watching two old friends catch up before we started with the official business. Nicole or Chris, can you tell us a little bit about how you guys know each other?
Well, we met at Michigan State. We're both graduate students at Michigan State together, played in the wind ensemble and the orchestra together. Probably played chamber music together, but it's been so long now that it's all a blur. We did academic classes together as well, and that's also where we sort of bonded a bit and being a bit nerdier, maybe than some of the other music students, and being a bit more into the nuts and bolts of the history and theory part of the degree. And we partied a bit together too, I have to say.
Yeah, you guys had some legendary parties at your house.
Yeah, we would buy a keg. We had three guys. We rented a house, and we would buy a keg, and we'd have the whole orchestra come by and just shred it at the end of the season. It was pretty fun. Plus, you had 10-cent bottle and can deposit stuff in Michigan, so we would collect bottles and cans all year, and they'd go have massive steak dinners at the end of the year because we would get $250 back from the government.
I didn't know you did that. Good job.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Actually, nobody knows that's the main reason everybody goes to grad school in Michigan is for the
beer. Oh no, for the 10-cent deposit. Yeah, so I mean that's how we know each other, and we've sort of maintained contact via the old people's network, which is Facebook, to sort of see what each other's up to, and that's basically it.
It's funny. I think we left MSU at the same time. I left in 99 and moved down to Bloomington, Indiana to do a doctorate. And you also left in 99 and moved to Evansville, Indiana.
Correct.
Where you joined Tails and Scales. Friend of Todd Zara-Lawler was in there with you.
Correct. Yeah, Zadie, first of all, I love Zadie. Zadie is awesome. She is a really interesting person, a really fine flutist. I was in that group for 2 years, and it was it's not defunct now, but at the time it was a really aggressive, nationally touring group. It was a quartet of musicians, a percussionist, low brass person who could play trombone and euphonium, a tuba, me, bass clarinet, and then a flutist, piccolo, flute, whatever, whistle, penny whistle, whatever we could do. And we would create newly composed shows for children and family audiences. And a lot of our shows were in school gymnasiums in Kentucky and Illinois and Florida. But some of our gigs were with like the Boston Symphony and the Utah Symphony and big orchestras. So we really ran the gamut of the venues and gigs that we would do. And we overlapped by a year. I was in there for 2 years, and Zadie was in there the last year that I was there. And I remember her audition like it was yesterday, because I'm a big player. I play loud, and I have a lot of body and volume. And for the first time in my life, I felt pushed by a flute player in that regard. I've been pushed by flute players usually in a technical regard, or especially with the ease, not the ease, but the apparent ease by which you can get around the instrument compared to an oboe or something like that has always been like, wow. But then to be also pushed in a way where I had to play sort of at my biggest and broadest to even be in the same space with her was mind-blowing. So we hired her immediately. She was just coming off, I think she was assistant principal in Hong Kong, Phil, and was just looking for a job. Right. As I had been. Like I left Michigan State at the same time as you, probably looking for a professorship. But at the time, I think there were 4 worthy jobs open that season. It was a really, really blank season. One of the jobs was at Brigham Young, which Elsa told me was flat out not a job for me. She's like, we would not survive in that environment because, as you know, I drink and use bad language, and I would just get fired immediately. So I didn't really have a place to go, and I got hooked up by somebody who's also a great friend of the flute, and that's Joan Tower, who I had met a couple of years prior. My teacher at Michigan State, Elsa Roeder, is a big proponent of new music, and her trio with her husband playing violin and a pianist ended up commissioning, I think, something like 450 new pieces for that combination of instruments. And some of them were big composers like Joan Tower or Giancarlo Menotti or Carl Husash. They had big ones. And Joan Tower came to Michigan State when the trio premiered her clarinet and violin and piano trio. And I got to play for her. And I played her concerto, which she was not expecting a student to play for her because she thought it was roughly impossible to play, which it is. I remember it again, like it was yesterday, because I had to play it for her, and she was sitting in the front row, and she'd forgotten most of it. It was sitting there with the score, and I'm just dying the whole time. But I guess it went well, because she invited me to go to the Norfolk Festival in Connecticut that year, where we really connected as people. Like, I really love her as a human being. And so when Tales of Scales had a position that was open, they were looking for a clarinetist with a big personality. And Joan was like, well, I actually have the guy for you. And she hooked me up with that job. They hired me. I owe a lot of certainly the parts of my early career to Joan. And she says the nicest things about the flute community that you can possibly imagine. Mainly that flutists are the most welcoming and eager to have new music from her than any group. Some other instruments, she says, are deeply unfriendly to that, and she doesn't like to talk about what those string group instruments might be, but the flute welcomes her with open arms, and she has the deepest love for the instrument and the community, which is awesome. I feel a little badly about that because she's written so much for the clarinet. I want to be in first place, but it doesn't work out that way. No, so that's where I met Zadie, and that's how I met Zadie. Joan recommended me for the job that I got right out of there, which was at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, which is a very small town.
But also, did you do your master's there? Didn't you go there?
I did.
Okay. I thought I remembered that.
I thought I got the job at Florida State that same season. I was a finalist at Florida State and really blew that job. I'm going to tell a story what not to do in a college audition situation. So I get invited for this audition for Florida State. It's 1999. Again, have an unfinished doctorate. I didn't expect to get invited to that, but I auditioned at Florida State for my doctorate degree when I ended up going to Michigan State. And they had opened up a second job, and Frank Kowalski, the teacher, was there, said, you got to get this guy to come back. And so I was lucky enough to do it, but I was in Tales and Scales at the same time. So that's a full-time touring group. We were on road 4 out of every 5 weeks. It was like a real gone from home, live in a hotel kind of job. In fact, I remember one tour we had like 35 days continuously on tour, and I think we stayed in 32 hotels over the course of those 35 days. It was insanity. So I'm having to prepare for this college teaching audition while I'm on the road. And I ended up having a break in my schedule that I could go from Las Cruces, New Mexico to Tallahassee, Florida, which are two very different reed environments. And that's like maybe not important to flutists, but for clarinetists, that's a real hard gig. So long story short, I did really well in the audition parts of the interview. I memorized my entire program because I knew I'd be competing against people who already had tenure and professor jobs, and I just really crushed. And I did really well in the teaching. I did really well in the chamber music stuff where I had to play with the faculty quintet. It was all really good. I felt really, and then I had to have a lunch with the graduate students directly after I played that recital, and I was on fire. I mean, I was really like, I'd barely slept. I'd been there like less than 24 hours. And I played Joan Tower, Wings. I played the Debussy Premier Rhapsody and the entirety of the Second Weber Clarinet Concerto, all from memory, bam, bam, bam. And just like one of those things that you're just in the zone, and I felt really great. But I remained in the zone, which was a really aggressive place for me. I was just like I put myself almost like in the wrong kind of meditative state, like a fully like vibrating state. So I go and I have lunch with the graduate students. We talk a little bit and they're like, well, what is your real advice? And I was like, how real do you want me to get? And they said real. And I was like, all right, well, you guys are all graduate students, which means that ostensibly what you would like to do is you would like to go teach at a university. In order for you to do that, you're going to have to pass an audition and an interview situation, which you are watching me do right now, which you saw me do an hour ago. So that's the level. You watched it happen. You watched something get crushed. Unless you're capable of competing at that level, you're not ready yet, because you literally saw that is the level. Now, that being said, I can get you there. Like, we will have to work really, really hard, but you're going to have to be truthful with yourself, because when you see people at auditions that you've gone to school, or when you go to auditions, you probably won't see people that you've gone to school with, but you will see me. And if you're not ready for that, then you're not ready for it. That was a huge mistake. That was all a huge mistake. I blew that really hard.
Did you say that because you were unimpressed by them after having worked with them, or?
I mean, not unimpressed, but they weren't ready to compete at that level, I didn't think. I had heard that same speech given to my friend Scott, my best friend growing up in high school, plays first clarinet in the St. Louis Symphony, and he played for many years second clarinet in the Boston Symphony. He won that audition really early. He won that audition when he was like 23. One of the guys, Tom Martin, who plays assistant principal clarinet in E flat, and that orchestra gave him that speech. He's like, listen, you're second clarinet. You want to be a principal clarinet. You're not ready for that, buddy. He's like, you're going to be out there with all your friends from NEC, but they're not going to be there. I'm going to be there. And that's real. Like, that's real. And so I was trying to be that real, but I think that I was so inartful and so like not cool about how I presented it. I was so like confident, like, like you've had performances where you felt like you crushed it, and that was just one of those days. And I was like, dude, I just laid that down. Let's talk about that some more. But I really if I would obviously do it differently again, but I do think that there was an element of truth in that. And that is sort of like, I think, a weakness of how graduate schools do prepare you for work, or at least they did when we were going to school, because I don't remember getting any real professional advice whatsoever in terms of making a resume, in terms of what's the difference between a resume and a CV? How do you write a cover letter? Like all of these things that you're supposed to actually be able to do. What should your recording look like? We didn't get any of that. I don't recall getting any of that.
It seems to me that you stand by what you said. And as someone who often suffers from foot in mouth syndrome and has done so in job interview situations, do you feel that was representative of who you are as a musician or as a prospective educator?
Probably.
I have a really good friend who always talks about search committees and sort of trusting the process. And she's said to me often, if it's something that you feel like you would have said on a random Tuesday, maybe it just wasn't the right fit, like, for you.
It could be.
And maybe it was a long-term service, not to end up there, because you
I mean, in my life, definitely, like it worked out for me in the end, for sure.
Yeah.
But man, I wanted that job. I really like, I was going to be like, oh, it was my first gig as Florida State. Suck, eat shit, everyone. Yeah, I was really, but then I got at East Carolina, I got the interim, there was an interim year job. And then they opened it up as a permanent tenure track gig, and I won that. And I stayed in North Carolina for a long time, 10 years. I got tenure. I did all of that stuff. I did a lot of great work at East Carolina. I had a lot of really fine students. I got to do, being as a professor, you can kind of do a lot of other things, which is awesome. I commissioned a lot of music. I played principal clarinet in the Winston-Salem Symphony, which is like a 6.5-hour round trip. So I would go there like 6 days a week, once a month, and teach from like 9 to 3, and then get in the car and get there and rehearse from 7 to 10, and then get back at 1, and then teach from 9 to 3, just like. But when you're like 30 and you want to play, it was the only chance to have a real principal clarinet gig where I could go play actual music, and mostly faculty from the School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, which are great musicians on the whole and super fun. But mostly all what I did, besides the orchestral playing, I played bass clarinet permanently with the North Carolina Symphony in Raleigh as well. But I did a lot of commissioning. I did a lot of new music, especially with my friend Ed Jacobs, who is just retired as on the composition faculty, and he runs a new music festival at East Carolina, and had since before I'd gotten there. He and I made a lot of stuff together. I had always been in school, done a lot of new music, but I've always considered myself like a real orchestral type of player. I play almost exclusively new stuff, but I also play very legitimately Brahms and Mozart. And I feel like what I really do with new music is try to keep a continuum of a craft of people making music with their friends. The flute story is full of composers who wrote music for particular people, not only for their virtuosity, but because they knew each other and because they were friends. And so same thing with the clarinet, especially the relationship that Brahms had with the clarinet player that he wrote most of his stuff for, especially the last 2 sonatas, which are really the cornerstones of our literature. He wrote for himself and this guy, Richard Molfeld, to play together. And I love that idea of just making music in a room with a friend. Short of that, I'm not really attracted to it, I find. And it may come all the way back to me and my friend Scott that I mentioned before, who plays in St. Louis. And we discovered all of this stuff together in my attic. We learned how to read music. We learned the Mozart concerto together. We took lessons together. We competed in all state together. We didn't care about anything except that we beat other people. We were not competitive with each other. And I think that friendship and that connection that I had with him is why I stuck with music. I, could have done other things, but coming back to it now, as an older person, the composer relationships that I have that are special to me, and the performing relationships that I have that are special to me, are friends and close friends, and people that I have that I stay at their house and they stay with me, and we eat together and we know each other's kids. And that's what music has ended up to be for me after all of the professorships and all of the other stuff, which I guess we haven't really talked about. I went to a really big idea really, really fast, which is just like, in my old age, and I'm 53 now, like, music has become about my relationships with people that I love. And short of that, I'm not really interested in playing with anybody else.
That's a wonderful position of privilege to be able to draw that line in the sand. It's interesting. I wanted to earlier unpack, you started this out by talking about new music. I don't think you were specifically doing this, but you were saying you did a lot of new music, but also you can do, Brahms. And I was thinking, isn't it funny the way we still have to explain ourselves when we do new music? I mean, I certainly feel that way too, that if you have ever played anything written by a living composer, someone's going to put you in a box and say, oh, that's the thing you do. And why is that? Good music is good music across the continuum. But it sounds like you figured out the continuum for you, which is those meaningful relationships.
Well, yes. And some of the first thing as well, but for 10 years, I've been working with a venue in Brooklyn called National Sawdust. And the entire mission of National Sawdust is to serve as an incubator for young composers, particularly women and non-binary, trans, and gay. It's a safe place for the traditionally marginalized to create art. And I really love that. I love seeing what really young composers are up to, but the older I get, the less I'm actually capable of playing what they write. I see, especially in New York, it gets very hairy very quick, and I see a lot of graphical scores. I see a lot of young composers get very excited about extended techniques, and they will want you to slap tongue everything on the planet. And I don't even do that. My friends and I who grew up before the internet, and my friends who played orchestras, none of us know how to do some of these things. I can't slap tongue. My friend Scott can't slap tongue. My friend Mark Dover, who plays in the Yamani Winds, can't slap tongue, because we all just learned this different way of playing the instrument that doesn't include this activity. And more is like that. And more to the point, I come from a pre-internet age. I am analog. And a lot of the young people now, 9/11 is almost 25 years ago. Almost every composer that I come into contact with at National Sawdust is a post 9/11 birth, much less being aware of anything. And I just think, for me, the world is so different, and the sound world that they grew up in is so different. The idea of going to a listening library at the university and having to check out a record and then sit down and check out earphones and play a record of Brahms 3, and that's how you were able to consume that excerpt, is medieval. It's like every one of these young people has had every piece of music or every pop music or everything either on their phone or on the computer or on a tablet for free. And it's just, I find that for me, the stuff that's being written today is not being written for me to play. And so I say that with love. I'm cool with it. But I think out of every generation looks back and goes, oh, these young kids, they don't know what they're doing. So different. But I think out of every generation in history, maybe the printing press was a different sea change for how people communicated with each other than the internet. But the generation that grew up prior to the internet and the generation that grew up after the internet experienced the world in very different ways. So that's one of the reasons why I've kind of taken a step back with some of the new music, except for things that are being particularly written for me, which are now mostly being written by people who know me really well, and they know what my capabilities are, and they know that I'm going to work really hard and that I'm going to play really hard, but I'm going to play music with notes. I need notes to play in order for me to feel like I'm taking myself out on the highway in a proper kind of way. I really am unhappy making sounds. That's just me. Students are capable of doing what young players coming out of Manhattan with a degree in straight up masters in new music performance, they crush. They are so good that I'm cool with them. I want to be their funny uncle. That's what I want to be. I want to be, hey man, you're awesome. Can I produce a gig for you? Can I make a showcase? Which I did for Mark Dover before he had just gotten the job with the Yamani Winds. He's a clarinet player. He's a fantastic player. But he was a young guy. He needed a showcase. So because National Sawdust allowed me to do whatever I wanted as a presenter, I just presented Mark in a concert of his own music and music that he loved. And that, I think, is my role with the younger players is to give opportunities and to appreciate, but I really don't want to compete with them at all. Like they'll beat my ass. Like for me, I want to work on things that feel good for me. I'm too I'm too old for this shit, and I really want to play, and one of the things that happened to me recently, I'm going out of order of all of the questions that you sent me. I'm sorry. We said that this would be tangent.
That's good. You're keeping me sharp.
Look, I mean, honestly, 2 years ago, I have a son who is 20 months old. His name is Lenny. And right before he was born, 2 months before he was born, I thought I had a heart attack. Right. I just read about Bob Odenkirk, who I think is the lead on Better Call Saul, right? And he had a heart attack on set and basically died. Like they stopped filming for a year, I think, because he died. And were it not for two friends there, he was on an exercise bike and he collapsed and his heart stopped and he was dead. And one friend knew CPR and the other friend had been taking first aid class and had paddles in their car, and they ran out to the car, and between the CPR and these serendipitous paddles, he like over the course of an hour, he died like 4 or 5 times, but they got him. And so I was sitting downstairs in my office and I had heart palpitations, and I was like, oh, I literally read this story maybe 2 days before, and my heart started racing, and I started I took my blood pressure and it was like 190 over 130, and I was like, oh my God. And so I went upstairs. I said to my wife, I think I'm having a heart attack. I walked myself to the hospital because I live in New York and it's a few blocks away. So I was just like, I'm just going to walk. So long story short, I spent a couple of days in the hospital. I did not have a heart attack, but for an afternoon, I believed I was going to have a triple bypass. This is not the interview you thought you were going to have today, but it's the interview you're going to get. They did what's called a catheterization. They put the camera up your vein into your heart, and they look around, and it turns out that I have some odd architecture in my body, but nonetheless that I did have some blockage problems. And at that moment, thinking about maybe having to have a major operation with 2 months until my son was going to be born was terrifying. And like a moment where I realized that I was going to remove a lot of things from my life that were making me stress. And some of these thoughts about not feeling like I was fitting into this scene that wasn't for me anymore. And beyond that, even some of the regular playing that I was doing had gotten me so nervous. Like my being was telling me I needed to take a break certainly from things that were giving me agita. And I care about a lot of things, and presenting concerts is really hard for me. And I do it. I've done a lot. I've done many concerts now, and I'm good at it. I have this knack for being able to see what the flow of a well-constructed concert will be, and then actually making it happen. Like when I produced shows at National Sawdust, I would hire all the musicians. I would pay all the musicians. I would design the show. I would run lights. I would often play. I would talk before the show. I would make sure all of the technical things. And that is a lot. And I'm the guy that you hire to show up. That's what I want to do. I want you to tell me when I'm supposed to play. Tell me when I'm supposed to be there. And all of the organizing things for other people was very, very difficult for me. So that's one of the things that I sort of got rid of, is a lot of ancillary things that were really bothering me, and people that I didn't necessarily want to play with all the time. And so I just, insulated myself.
I'm glad you came out the other side of that, and you are healthy and figured some valuable things out about your life.
You know what I found? I found them a really musical pastime now that I really love, that it's not music, and it is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that doesn't sound like, do you know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is?
Is it I see strip malls?
Well, it's grappling. Like, judo, they throw people, right?
Sure.
You put people on the ground, you throw people with judo. Well, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is what happens after that. And believe it or not, the way that you have to learn how to move your body is exactly like you have to learn how to play music, in the sense that you learn, this E to F sharp feels like this. Oh, and then you put that together and that's one idea. And then E to F sharp to G sharp, and then E major feels like this. And so while I'm working on the music, I've also been working on this physical activity that is so directed, and you have to practice daily. I go 5 to 6 times a week and fight with boys in a basement in pajamas. And believe it or not, it's the most musical exercise. It doesn't sound like it would be, but it really is.
I use a lot of sports and physical activity metaphors when teaching my students, which is hilarious because I don't do any of those things. But I have been privileged to watch some folks do tennis training and a little bit of gymnastics training, just in things that are ancillary to my life. And it's been fascinating to me how you can break up something like a back handspring into a series of really small gestures, which they drill. Like your analogy about the pinky finger being whatever, they'll drill this really tiny movement that in and of itself is nothing, but when put with several other tiny movements, suddenly they're like flying across the room backwards and upside down, in much the way that I think probably ring finger drills on flute eventually turn into the Daphnis solo.
And to going hand in hand with that, with the sports idea, is like, I think there's a lot of similarities between high level sports psychology and high-level music psychology. There is a book that I'm going to eventually write called Music and the Art of Jiu-Jitsu, I think. And it really is, it's all a meditation on practice.
But it's funny to me how many musicians get to a really high level and are, doing things at sort of the peak of our field. And then they're like, crisis of faith, or in your case, crisis of health, and they discover some other thing that is on the outside completely unrelated, but it brings them a wholeness or a fullness that then turns their soul back to the thing that probably attracted them to the field in the first place. So for you, it's jiu-jitsu. I have another friend that it's raising prize orchids, like whatever. It is something that is not outwardly music, but fills them in a way that they're then able to go back to doing something that made them who they are.
I feel like you are so accurate and you hit the nail on the head so much there that I should be paying you an hourly rate. That was, I think that's exactly right. Like, I needed something in my life to funnel that energy, that creative energy into, that was not something that was making me crazy in the head and in the heart. And, we've all been doing this for a long time. I've been playing since I was 11. And so that's 42 years of playing the clarinet. It's like, after a while, it's like, it's enough already. Let's do something else for a while. But the thing I wanted to get back on was the sports psychology thing. Cause I talked about that when I was teaching a lot. And I definitely talk about it to myself a lot when I'm performing, in terms of problem solving for the most part, because we all have issues that arise. Like, when I was taking auditions, I had several auditions in a row where I just blew Mendelssohn 3. I could not find in practice in the audition room, blew Mendelssohn 3. And so we all get these either yips or inevitable moments in live performance that you don't know what's next. And that's when I really heavily lean for myself on sports psychology, especially. I think about, 3 people, but LeBron James obviously has been great for a long time, and he has really bad games. And what do you do when you have a bad game is that you trust your preparation. What he does is he trusts his preparation. He doesn't do anything differently on Saturday. If he laid a clam on Friday, when he comes out on Saturday, he doesn't spend 5 hours trying to fix things. He does his regular routine. And as musicians, we all find routines that work for us in our daily practice. And when we get closer to things, sometimes we stray further and further from that routine. And actually, it's the routine that got us there. And so trusting your preparation on that level is one thing. And the other thing that I lean on is a really straight up problem solving thing that I learned by watching Tiger Woods back in the day before he was he fell from grace. And he had this remarkable ability to approach a problem as it was. Say he was not perfect, so he shanked a shot off into the woods somewhere, right? So some people will get really frustrated upon their approach, and you allow any sort of number of things to creep into your mind. But Tiger Woods was really capable of literally forgetting what had happened to put him in this situation that he needed to solve at that point. It no longer literally mattered. Here is the situation. How do you address this problem? So I do that, occasionally you have a moment in performance where you flub. Maybe you counted a restaurant or something, we all have those moments, but if you are literally capable of forgetting that and letting the new problem just be what it is, you'll be much more successful. That's the two things about sports psychology that I lean on the most. And you know what? In terms of mistakes, audiences don't care unless you're terrible. Like if you're terrible, that's one thing. But if you flub a thing or two but you're really going for it, who cares? So if you're capable of forgetting it and not letting it become that performance where you start dropping everything and it does become terrible, who cares? Drop some notes. Walk the tightrope. Like fall off every now and again. The things that we do, especially when you talk about ice skating or gymnastics, the level that those people are competing on is so difficult that it's basically physically impossible. Like to do a quad axel or whatever they do in skating, to rotate 4 times and then land and skate away from that is literally physically impossible. But because they practice it, they do it. And, that's the difference or the similarities between our high level performance and theirs is that some of the stuff, deafness is impossible. It really is. And but we have to figure out how to do it, and the only way to figure out how to do it is to just drill, baby, and instill that confidence until you are, was it the old saying, like good players practice until they get something right and great players practice until they can't play it wrong. And if we practiced half as much as ice skaters practiced, we'd all be Paganini, I think, because they put in like 12 to 14-hour days.
But we can't. Or I think our bodies would be destroyed too soon.
I mean, violinists and pianists do.
Yeah. I mean, if they don't go crazy or end up injuring themselves first. I want to run something past you and tell me if I'm getting this wrong or not. But as you're talking about this, and this isn't something you've said, but where my brain went, I guess, the routine and the routine is kind of like the fundamentals of the instrument. But my approach has become, any given piece that I'm learning or that I'm performing is really just another way of drilling my understanding of how to control the instrument. And so that routine that you're practicing and that you should always stick close to, regardless of what you're about to perform, is also you retaining those general principles and then creatively applying them to each new situation. So the clarinet is the clarinet all day long, right? It presents a quite varied but finite number of possibilities. Any one of our instruments can do certain things and can't do other things. And so your job over a lifetime is to learn how to do as many of those things as you can bring yourself to do. Those skills get mixed and matched as you identify what needs to be done based on the notes on the stand.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that a lot. But I also as you could tell over the course of this interview, I have almost no form. I am without form. I am shapeless. And so I need structure for myself to learn and thrive. Otherwise, I will just go floating off into outer space. So for me, I have a really very regimented routine that I go through every day when I practice. And that may be some of why I experienced some burnout, because it takes me 75 to 90 minutes to do my scales. And it's really? But I think if you could find a medium between perhaps being as militant as I've been, because I spend 5 days on one key area and I move the tempo from 60 to 160, and I do all of the scale stuff. I do all of the arpeggio and thirds and returning scales. And then I do 2 pages of etudes in the same key. And that takes a long time after long tones, after articulation studies. So for me, like doing that stuff when I get to close to performance is the routine that I have mentally that I have to do. Otherwise I turn into nothingness. I think that actually being healthy is not doing that, and maybe doing more of what you're talking about.
You are also describing that, application, which I think is so important. It sounds like you just have a much better attention span than I do. I just think I don't probably have the discipline to do that much. It sounds admirable.
I have ADHD for almost everything, but I can achieve on some level hyper focus on some things, which is part of that spectrum occasionally is a hyper focus. And so I will get really kind of like in the weeds on the legato or on the evenness of the technique during the scale work and stuff like that. I don't know if it's so much stick-to-itiveness as it might be mental illness. A touch of OCD in terms of, can that be a little bit more even? Stravinsky, I think, was the same way. I had a quote from Stravinsky says something like, ultimate structure equals ultimate freedom, or complete structure equals complete freedom. Mm-hmm. And for me, knowing what the lines are, then I can really color. When I don't know what the lines are, then I might just do anything. So I do have to create those frameworks in my practice, and I'll schedule out like which pieces I want to make sure that I get to, which sections I want to get to. And I'll have that all ready to just like sort of go when I'm doing it. And I'll try to fill as much like 3.5 to 4 hours of full work and then stop. I don't try, I like try to stop on a schedule. Unless I like feel like I really completed an idea and I have like 10 minutes left to go, I'll stop. My brain can't handle more than 4 hours. Now, you're right, Nicole. It's like research basically says you can learn like 3 hours of material a day. Right. So I don't really know what the profit on pianists practicing for 12 to 14 hours a day is, except that their music is so insane. We play one note at a time and I could barely handle it. Sometimes I look at my pianist music and I'm like, how do you even read that? But for me, 3 to 4 hours is basically all I can handle.
This has all been fascinating. If you could indulge me for a moment, I am curious to back up to your life with Open G Records.
Open G Records is me, basically. I left East Carolina a little earlier than I wanted to. And the reason that happened was a bit of personal tragedy. I was going to get married. My wife lives here in New York. I live in New York now. But a lot of my friends would live in New York and teach. It wasn't so far of a flight to live in New York for a couple of weeks, go to North Carolina, teach for a couple of weeks. There were several people in the faculty who did that. And I was planning to make my transition to living in New York like that. In late 2009, my mom got brain cancer and she died in February. It was a three-month car crash. And I got engaged during that time. And then we got married in August. And then my wife's mom died of cancer in April. So it was a 14-month crucible of horrible stuff. And I knew that at that point I couldn't go back because I'd been through the year with my mom and I knew what Rachel was about to go through. And I was like, I cannot split time knowing what's coming up. But during that year prior to her mom dying, and it was just my mom that was dead, I took a fall leave of absence. And because my wife makes a good living, I was able to take that absence unpaid. So they could use that money to hire my placement for the semester and not worry about any sort of budgetary, you know how it is at a college. You got to shuffle. So they really, really have to shuffle. And to sort of thank me for that, they gave me like about 10 grand to go make a recording. I got over the initial shock of my mom being dead. And then I get a year, you got to use the money. You can't in budgetary things. You have to find a way to spend it or it goes away. So fortunately, through Joan Tower and some other connections that I had in New York, I was able to get a really fine engineer and editor to work with me. His name is Adam Abeshouse. He's won a couple of Grammys, and he's really not only a great engineer, but also a producer. He's a really, really fine person and has a good psychology about how to record. So I made a recording, and at the end of it, we were listening to it as he was burning the master CD, which is kind of funny. It's of a period now because they didn't really make CDs anymore, obviously, but I say, what do I do? It's like, okay, now I have this recording. Who do I give it to? He's like, honestly, man, he's like, it's 2011, which it was at the time. He's like, I don't know why you necessarily give it to anybody. He's like, why don't you just do it? So then the idea became, I do have these people that I play with. The whole idea that I talked about at the beginning, this gathering of friends, consider a house band. Open G Records has a house band and it's players at every position. And then we make things out of that house band and people write for us and we perform it and we record it. So I was like, well, if I can make this thing for myself, that's a vanity thing. But if I could make it for my friends, because really I made Open G Records for Scott, my best friend from high school, because he's a genius. And I felt like somebody should do something with that. So that was my original idea. And so then my pianist, Zach Bjarkin, who teaches at Cornell, who also plays piano on my recording, is close friend. So I did a recording for him. Then I started to realize I was good at it. And also that led into the live production. So like the first live production that I did was at National Sawdust in Brooklyn. They gave me carte blanche. I don't know. I'm going to name check Paola Prestini, who's the artistic director at National Sawdust, because I'm not really sure why she gave me the opportunity to just do whatever I wanted. But when she saw something in the way that I explained to her what my intentions were, and so I started to produce shows there. And the first show that I produced was for Scott, and I played on that. And my friend Zach, it ended up being for like 6 friends. We made music together, including Adam Abe's house. And the cornerstone of all of those was a new performance of a work by Pierre Boulez, Dialogues with My Shadow. And it's for a solo clarinet and 6 to 7 pre-recorded sections from the same player being projected to 6 discrete speakers that are spread throughout the venue. This clarinet player will be playing live, and then you'll also hear him in the right back corner, and then you'll hear him in the left back corner, and they'll be in the front, and sometimes he spins around. So we made this new spatialization of that piece, and that ended up being the most audacious and successful project outside of the recordings that Open G Records did, because 2 years later, we performed it in that configuration in Brooklyn and the Pulitzer Museum in St. Louis. And at the time, the conductor of the St. Louis Symphony, David Robertson, was an enormous Boulez fan, and it had been Boulez's assistant at the Ensemble Intercontemporain, and was deeply into Scott playing this piece as the concerto spot on a St. Louis Symphony performance. And it ended up being the concerto spot on the season opening performances of August of 2016. They played like an overture and then left the stage. And then my friend Scotty, my little friend from high school, stood on stage by himself and then had himself projected around Powell Hall in the St. Louis Symphony for 20 minutes while an audience tried to figure out what the hell was going on. And it was magnificent. Like 2 kids who knew each other from high school made something together. And then for whatever reason, that became the season opener of a major American symphony orchestra. Was really the culmination of that kind of idea of making stuff with your friends, because all I could think about the entire time was us learning how to play quarter notes together, learning how to play with the metronome together. And that is Open G Records. I ended up writing a lot, and I ended up making some films for Open G Records too. And I have a film that I'm working on right now with my friend Joan Tower. If you go into YouTube and you go to the Open G Records channel, probably the video that is the best on there is a day that I spent with George Crumb, and a film that I made of spending the day with George Crumb. And that and the St. Louis performance were the 2 great things that I made with Open G Records, because you literally feel, you go into where George Crumb composes with me. You watch him build a score. He talks about how he drew all of the shapes, because all of those scores that we see in the music history textbooks, all of those beautiful George Crumb scores are by hand. And he drew all of those things by hand. And So that's what I'm doing with Joan now, is spending time with Joan with the videographer at her house, and just like spending a day in the life of my friend. So I think that's sort of like what my calling is now, is making art and music with my friends. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can do that, where I can say, instead of playing in the Riverside Symphony next weekend and playing Beethoven 9 for the 47th time, to my friends who play in the Riverside Symphony and play Beethoven 9 for the 47th time, it's fine. It's just not for me. It never was. I'm very lucky that I get the opportunity to just make things. One quick other thing. The art direction was really important to me, because there are some labels, especially like pop labels in the 60s, that Stax and Motown, where if you looked at the cover, you just knew where the record was from. And so I have the same art director for all of my poster art, for my performances, all of the art for all of the recordings. Everything has been run through the same person, and everything looks the same. And I just wanted to make something beautiful that would last beyond my lifetime, maybe, because once you record something, it's there. I just want to leave the world with more nice stuff than I entered with it. I would like to leave the world more beautiful than I found it.
This has been fascinating and not what I expected at all. And I loved all of it. And I really appreciate you sitting down with us today.
Definitely was not a pure music conversation, but that's where I'm at.
We're people. But one more music question that we always like to end with, if you don't mind.
No, please, let's do it.
Could you please name 3 pieces of music that you're listening to right now? Could be any genre, by the way.
Well, I've been listening to a lot of older Radiohead recently. I'm like revisiting pre-electronic Radiohead. So when they were still like a guitar-based rock band. So the Bends and OK Computer I've been listening to a lot of. I listened to a lot of the late Brahms piano music. I love Brahms, and the older I get, the more I love Brahms. So I think it's Opus 118 I've been listening to a lot of, with this Radu Lupu recording that's just amazing. And because I recently went to hear at Carnegie Hall, I heard the Orchestra of Paris do a performance with Klaus Mikala, who just got the principal conducting job of the Chicago Symphony. He's 28 years old, this guy. And they did a all Stravinsky program. They did the full Firebird. And then in the second half, they did Rite of Spring. And I had not been to a concert that made my hair catch on fire more than that. So I've been listening to a lot of Firebird. I love Firebird. Not that I don't love Rite of Spring, but something about Firebird is still so effusively and just like unrepentantly romantic and lush and full. So Firebird, not the suite though. I got to get it all. You got to give me 40 minutes of that or I'm not happy.
I just feel like Firebird feels good to play too. I mean, it is devilishly hard, but
it's hard as hell.
Rite of Spring never felt good to me. It felt like following directions.
I think it's kind of
particular parts feel good, even though they are difficult in Firebird.
I think it might be part of it though, right? It's like part of Rite of Spring is that it's damned uncomfortable for everyone, and I think that might be part of the art. It's like when you go to like see modern art and you don't know what it means, but it makes you uncomfortable. I think that's a successful work of art for that reason. So I feel the same exact way. I've never sat down and been like, man, I feel really good after that performance of Rite of Spring. I really nailed that and I felt comfortable the whole time. Not that you feel comfortable playing Firebird, but you generally know where you are. There could be moments in Rite of Spring where you literally may not know where you are for a moment or two. I think that's part of the experience.
Could be, yeah. I think I just want to play a damn melody too.
This is what I keep asking composers.
Yeah.
Like I literally I want a pretty song. Will somebody write me a pretty song, please? That's what I want more than anything else. As I get older and older and older, I want to play a pretty song.
I remember at Michigan State, we were down in the basement practice rooms, and several of us one evening, it was the evening before the first round of the concerto competition, and we were all sweating through our parts our last minute practice. I was very immature as a practicer back then and thought every last second that I crammed in, I might finally get the Nielsen right.
Yeah.
And you walked by and I was like, I don't even know how frantic and sloppy I sounded, but I'm pretty sure it sounded pretty bad. You walked by and you were standing in the window and you knocked on the door, and I opened the door and you said, "Come on, Reiner, you can only play so many notes in a day. Time to get up." Thank you.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here. I hope I gave you something interesting. Thanks for asking. I really appreciate it. Super fun.
It's been great talking to you.
You too.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.